think we'll get started. This is only a 30-minute session with 15 minutes for questions, so we don't have that much demo time. All right, everyone. Welcome to another How to Hex session. I am Izzy, your host and resident Hexpert. Today we're going to be talking about orchestrating Hex notebooks with the Hex API and some of the orchestration integrations that we partner with. This is sort of a relatively advanced topic. I'm assuming that if you are here, you are sort of like intending to learn about the API and orchestration, etc. But this isn't going to be a bare bones 0 to 1 Hex demo. We'll sort of do a really brief explanation of the core Hex product, but mostly focus on the Hex API and using it to orchestrate notebooks. So just a heads up. And if you're interested in more of a full 0 to 1 Hex demo, you can check them out on the website or look at the full archive of how to hexes, most of which go through more of the traditional data analysis flow in the product. Cool. So the way that these sessions work, I do a demo for about 10 or 15 minutes, super quick, and then I reserve the rest of our time, about 10 or 15 minutes, for questions from you all about what you just saw, the product, other questions you have. They don't need to be related to the API, etc. And so yeah, after 15 minutes or so, the floor will be yours. So think of your questions, ask them in the chat, and I'll get to them after the core demo. Cool. With that, the only slides I have, because this is mostly a demo. So let's back out of this slide deck. And today we're going to be talking about the Hex API. So Hex ships with a built-in API that is really relatively lightweight. Maybe I'll actually look at the docs quickly for it. So we have just 5 endpoints. You can list projects, you can run a project, you can get the runs of a project, you can get the run status for a run that you've triggered, you can cancel a run. And what you might notice about this is that there isn't necessarily a way to extract the results from a project. You can't run query or something like that. You're just sort of triggering a run and then you're done. Your request is ended. You don't get data back from the SQL queries in the project from that run. So what this is really an orchestration API, right? We're not using it as a sort of thing where you can use the Hex API to run your SQL queries, get back data, push that data to somewhere else. You use the Hex API to sort of build DAGs or schedule projects to run at certain times. Maybe those projects have side effects, like they upload data to S3 or they write data back to a warehouse. But really the core Hex API is used for orchestration via these endpoints. Today I'm going to give you a super quick example of that. It's obviously a really advanced topic, and you can build a lot of stuff here. Actually, one of our audience members today, Olivier, has a really great blog on Medium in which he talks about some really advanced usage of the Hex API, specifically with Dagster, to automatically publish assets from Hex to Twitter. So I'm going to give a really brief surface level demo, and if you're interested in more, I highly recommend checking out Olivier's work. I'll send a link to everyone in the chat. Cool. And with that, let's walk through a really, really simple demo here. So we'll actually start in just a pretty standard looking Hex project. This is a project that one of our customers, Game Changer, actually uses to build their lifetime value models for their users. And this project is it culminates in write back to their data warehouse that actually powers their application, it powers their marketing life cycles, etc. So this is obviously all on demo data, not the real data, but the flow of this Hex project gets a bunch of data about users, their subscription, their usage, their statistics, what kind of user they are, sort of compiles this all together into a large data set about what kind of member they are. Do they have a yoga membership? Do they have a sauna membership? What's their level of expertise, etc. And then writes a bunch of this data back to Snowflake at different steps throughout the process. So it writes back a training data set, then it actually trains a model on this to predict the lifetime value of a certain user based on those values. Or well, first it predicts tenure, Then it predicts the entire lifetime curve, a whole bunch of stuff to predict the lifetime value of their users. It's super important. They run it regularly, and it writes assets back into Snowflake. So this is sort of our actor notebook. This is a notebook in Hex that does most of the work. It's querying the data, crunching the numbers, building the model, writing data back into Snowflake. There's also an input parameter here, segment, which is sort of the email domain type in our demo data set, but it's the segment of user that's used to parameterize all of this code. And so we can filter down the group of users that we're interested in based on this. And when we change this, it will trigger a re-execution of the entire DAG of this project and build an LTV model for free-mail users or build an LTV model for educational users, et cetera. So that's our actor notebook, nothing to do with the API yet. But I've also made this controller notebook. And what this controller notebook is going to do is let us trigger API-based runs of that actor notebook with certain input criteria here. So I've set this project up basically to let us run certain segments of that project automatically and trigger those writebacks, those side effects from the actor notebook into Snowflake. And we could, schedule this controller notebook to run every day, or it could be run manually. Say like somebody wants to only refresh the educational segment in Snowflake, they could open this notebook, select educational and run it, or they could run all 4 of these. So what's actually going on here is we're using the Hex Toolkit package, which is a convenience Python library that we've built and is included in every Hex project to access the Hex API. You can actually just use the Hex API with like requests or any languages HTTP request library, just like you would with any API token. But it's a lot easier if you are using it within Hex for orchestration to use Hex Toolkit. So you can import Hex Toolkit. You'll find all the docs for this on our website. And then you can instantiate a new API client by running HTK or Hex Toolkit.get API client, passing in your token. Just a cool little aside about how Hex works. You'll notice this isn't an environment variable, and the sort of security conscious among you are probably like, ooh, bad boy, not using an environment variable. What I'm actually doing is using a project secret. And so if I print out Hex API token and sort of try and, steal it somehow or exfiltrate it, it will show secret value. It automatically redacts it, but it still works here. Secrets are a special type of variable that you can configure in projects separate from environment variables, specifically for things that are, meant to be kept secret. Because if you share this notebook with a bunch of people and you've set a sensitive environment variable, and then, they print os.getEnv, and then like the secret thing, they've stolen your variable, but secrets cannot be read out unless by admins or editors of a project. So just a cool little aside there. So we create our API client, and then, just like we saw in the docs, we have a bunch of different methods we can call on that client. We can get project runs, we can get project, list projects, run project, etc. All those things that we just saw. We're going to run projects. We already have this project ID, which we've grabbed just out of the URL of this project. Every Hex project has the ID right in the URL. So we paste that in. We pull together the data that we want to use to sort of parameterize our multiple project runs that we're orchestrating. So I'm grabbing email domain type, which are going to be our segments. I'm actually using here a sort of little known feature of Hex, which is the table input type. This is an input parameter type that can be driven by a data frame and gives you a spreadsheet-like interface to add data. So we can actually start with the full list of potential segments, and maybe we want to trigger our API run with only company, free mail, and internal segments. So now we've got our jobs, the list of jobs that we want to kick off with this controller notebook. This little tiny function is what's actually going to do most of the work here. It's called run project. I just wrote this really quickly. It builds a JSON request body from the input parameters that I've built here. So There's actually a type included in the Hex API package called run project request body that lets you really easily construct input parameters. I'm building this segment input param. All you do is just name your object in the input parameters object, the exact same thing as the input parameters named in your app. It's that simple. And then we call run project with the ID and with our body. And then what we can do is take our jobs and in this line of code here, basically run the project for each of the segment names in our jobs data frame. I'll kick this off. Oops, here, segment name. Oh, it's because I reset this name here. Change this back. Segment name. And now we see this running, it's kicking off all of those jobs, and it returns really fast because, again, this isn't an actual data fetch API, it's an orchestration API, so it doesn't wait for the projects to finish. Remember, we could actually look for the status of those, because if we look at our client methods available, we could call, get run status on a project or get project runs. But you can also just look at these in the UI. So if we go over to our project, we refresh this here, in the scheduled runs pane over here on the left, we can see the runs that we just triggered at 1:12 p.m. kicked off. One has already been successful, one is running. And actually, if we pop into Snowflake and refresh our schemas here and look at the schema that this writes to, I'll make this bigger. We see down here the data that we've just written back into Snowflake: LTV value, buckets, company, disposable, free mail, internal. And we can see it was created just now. So this like very, very simple orchestration demo worked and wrote back data into Snowflake. And we were able to sort of take one notebook that had a side effect and sort of exported data off into Snowflake and control it and potentially run it at scale or like 12 different ways or on a schedule with this controller notebook. So this is a really simple example of like something that can actually scale to be a really complex way to architect crazy pipelines using Hex. Before I end in just a few minutes, I want to show one more example. I'm actually going to share my whole screen for this of doing this with a real orchestrator. So, this works. We have customers that actually do this a lot. We're actually running a session next week with Patronics on Tuesday, I believe, which you can find on our website, where they talk about their own controller actor notebook setup for orchestration. But a lot of people like to use a more robust orchestration tool for orchestrating their DAGs and their pipelines, like Dagster, for example. And we actually have a great integration with Dagster. Oops, I am a bad boy and I left my Hex API key here. But I'll deactivate it presently. We have a great integration with Dagster that gives you some built-in utility functions to run Hex projects without having to sort of do all that Hex toolkit import stuff or actually like write raw HTTP requests. So similar to Hex toolkit, within Dagster, you can add Hex resources and configure these as software-defined assets in Dagster. And so here we've built a really, really simple Dagster pipeline that basically just has a hello world asset just to sort of put something in the DAG. And then we create a Hex asset that's dependent on that. And so you could imagine, this asset being maybe an upstream sink that would prep the data that the LTV write back step needs, or any number of complex pipeline steps. And then we can key the run of this Hex project off of those dependent assets, run this project. And then, of course, you can configure this whole thing to run on a schedule to like match up with your ETL syncs, etc. And so if we fire this up in Dagster, now we see Dagster, we see our extremely simple DAG here with a just dummy hello world step and then our Hex asset step. And if we close this and materialize everything, we'll see these begin to kick off, view our run. And then hello world obviously ran immediately, so it triggered our write back step. And then just like before, if we go over here and look at our run log, we see that new Dagster triggered orchestration run happening right here. So obviously, again, like an incredibly simple, I don't think it could get more simple example of how to orchestrate projects in Dagster with Hex, or just using a controller actor notebook paradigm. But I hope that these give you sort of an idea of like the art of the possible and the kinds of things that you can build with the Hex API. Again, Olivier's blog posts about what he's doing with Dagster and Hex are like pretty state of the art, and I highly recommend reading through these, looking at his architecture, and sort of understanding where the value is coming from, why he's using Hex to orchestrate certain jobs, and how Dagster comes into play there, because it's a really cool setup. Cool. So that concludes the immediate demo portion of this. I'm happy to answer all of your questions about the Hex API, Dagster integration, orchestrating projects in general, or just anything Hex related. If you have specific features that you're interested in as you've been evaluating the tool, really anything. So please pop into the chat with your burning questions, and I'll live demo stuff to you or walk through absolutely anything that's on your mind. Looks like we have a few questions here. You're welcome to use the Q&A tool or just the chat as well. Someone's asked, do run calls to the API get queued? Is there a maximum number of parallel runs for a Hex project? That's actually a really good question. I don't know the answer. I do know that a lot of folks tend to just manually limit the number of parallel runs that they kick off in their controller code because of the number of SQL queries that Hex projects can kick off. And obviously, like your warehouse presumably has some limits here too. And when you set up a data connection in Hex, you configure the max number of connections. But it's still kind of a good idea to not like inundate your Snowflake warehouse with 10,000 SQL queries, because it can back things up for other non-Hex users. Let's see if it's in the docs. I don't know. I think my guess would be that there is not a maximum number of parallel runs, because we don't say that there is. But per what I said, it might be a good idea to not kick off like thousands and thousands of runs at once, because it can back up your warehouse. The example we're going to run through next week with Patronics, I think they limit it to like four parallel runs at the same time. Someone asked, does this work similarly for other orchestrators like Airflow? Yes, it does. We actually have an Airflow integration or provider that we've built and we maintain. I just chose to demo Dagster because I think Dagster is kind of cool. But it works exactly the same with Airflow. You can install an Airflow provider, set everything up exactly the same way with your API token. And yeah, you get like all of the same interfaces into the Hex API that you had before. So here, I can paste this in, and I'll send out all of these resources after the fact as well. Cool. What else? I'm happy to answer questions that aren't about the API if there are folks here that are newer to Hex and are interested in more of the like standard development pipeline that doesn't involve like crazy API orchestration stuff. Ask away. Absolutely anything that you guys are curious about. Someone has a question about execution of the notebook itself. This is actually something that's really cool to show. So Hex notebooks, if you're familiar with like typical Jupyter notebooks, they don't run just in the sort of same cell 1, cell 2, cell 3, cell 4 linear fashion. They actually run with a graph-based execution model. So for every notebook, we construct a DAG, which is actually relevant to the orchestration related theme at hand of that project and all of the cells in that project. So here you can see that like pretty much everything is feeding out of this Snowflake connection. And then we have a bunch of steps down off stream of that. And like this SQL query here feeds code cell 4, which copies that data and sort of builds it into this new data frame. But the lineage is preserved, and we can see where that data frame goes down here, and then ultimately culminates in this write back step, but is then combined in this step to go here. And so when you rerun a certain cell in Hex, like we'll just rerun this cell here, you'll notice that the upstream cells don't have to rerun. And this cell just ran really quick. And then so did this one. Or is that a dependent? Yeah. But the upstream cells didn't run, and we didn't have to like do the reset and run all or restart and run all thing that you find yourself doing in Jupyter a lot of the time. So we automatically compute any stale dependencies. So like, let me show an example of that. This code cell here is dependent on this cell here. And so if I go up here and I change something about this code cell, like maybe I change the low variance threshold, this cell becomes stale, quote unquote. And when I go down here and I run this cell, it'll say stale output, and it'll automatically also trigger a run of the upstream cells as well to make sure that everything is sort of all in sync all the time without you having to. Oh, I wasn't in auto mode, but now it'll work. Yeah, so we can see that this now triggered and reran, so that everything is always synced up and you don't have to sort of manually make sure you're stepping through and running all of the cells one by one. Good question. Naive question. How do I get users' input into my projects? It's not a naive question at all. It's a great question. So let's open a new project. And maybe we'll just add a simple Python cell. It says like print hello. And maybe we'll add a simple SQL query. Let's like select one. And we want to add some user input into here and like parameterize this with user input essentially. The way that you do this in Hex is with input parameters, which are little pre-built widgets that give you a bunch of different ways to accept user input, checkboxes, CSV uploads, even date pickers, drop-downs, sliders, etc. So let it drop down, and maybe we'll call this, I don't know, name. And we'll give it, or maybe we'll make it a text field if we're saying name. I'll call it name. Now that we have this, a user can put anything they want in here. So like my name is Izzy. And now you have a variable called name that contains the user's input that you can reference, that you can reference anywhere in Python. So, we could change this to be like print hello name. If I run this, it'll say hello Izzy. If I change this to like my full name, that reactive execution model that I mentioned would automatically rerun the downstream cells and keep everything up to date. When you go to actually like build an app, which you can do with Hex, basically turn any notebook into a data application, you can click add to app builder. We'll add this to the app builder as well. And then we'll actually parameterize the SQL query with that as well. So we'll say like select name as name. When we run this, we get the name Izzy out. We'll add that to our app as well. And now we see all of these elements here along with the user input. And if we publish this application, boop, 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 should be pretty quick. Then when a user goes to visit this publish app, and you could imagine this is a sort of extravagant dashboard with charts and selection options and stuff. When they pop in here and enter their name, that user input will feed into the backend, the whole app will re-execute, etc. And so that's like the exact same simple paradigm that is used to power even really complicated, super parameterized apps like this one, where you have like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You have like 10 different selection options. They're being used to parameterize like tons of different cells in different ways to build these really rich slice and dice data experiences. Behind the scenes, it's all just these input parameters that give you a variable that you can use to parameterize any Python or SQL code you want. So if I pop behind the scenes of this project, we see our input parameters all set up here that give us little variables out. And then you can see in this SQL query, maybe if I make this a little bigger, that we're parameterizing the SQL query with all of these variables using the double bracket Jinja syntax. There's some really great resources in our docs about this as well that I can link. If you go to input parameters, I'll send this to the whole chat. There's some really great examples and tutorials of this in action. Cool. I think we have time for like one more question, probably, about anything. Doesn't need to be about the API. Don't be shy. If I dump all my data from different sources in the warehouse using Fivetran or something, can I do DBT-like stuff in Hex? This is an interesting question. The answer is yeah, of course. But I think the immediate follow-up is like, should you? I think you can, but should you? I think the obvious thing there is that like Hex is really designed to make exploratory analysis and like complex data work that culminates in some kind of insight or output really, really, really easy. So if you look at some of our amazing examples or the things that like customers are getting the most value out of, right? They're things that have like a report on the outside, or like you have to do really, really, really complex analysis, and then like discover something and then share what you've discovered in an app or in a like white paper or something like that. When I think of like DBT like stuff, it's much more like the pipelines that are run to power the data that will then be used in Hex to do that analysis, right? It's sort of upstream of Hex. I think the requirements aren't always necessarily the same. Like you want really, really, really robust orchestration. You want like everything to be really neatly managed in little .SQL files. Um, and so I think for like really simple stuff and for ETL pipelines that involve, like data science steps, like we were looking at earlier with that LTV modeling, little point things can make sense to do in Hex, but I wouldn't like use Hex instead of DBT because I think you would start to run into a lot of technical debt. Hex is sort of meant to be used on the output of DBT pipelines, right? To sort of like dig into the data, discover things, and then communicate those insights. Does that make sense? Cool. Um, I think with that, we will wrap up. You'll get a recording of this in your email, along with some links to some of the projects that I showed, some of the other resources like the Airflow provider, the Dagster. I'm not quite sure what they call them, the Dagster package, um, and anything else that I shared here. And feel free to reach out with questions anytime. Thanks for coming.